I didn't think it would happen again. Not another fight over something so small. At least, it started that way. These days, it felt like every conversation between Sophie and me had the potential to turn into a standoff. I used to think I knew her, used to believe we were a team. But that evening, sitting across from her in the dim light of our living room, I realized I didn't recognize the person she'd become, or maybe the person she always was. It began with me trying to be considerate. I'd had a long day at work, but decided to ask, "Do you want to spend some time together tonight?" Simple enough, right? Just a gesture to set aside distractions, to focus on us for once. I thought she'd appreciate it. I thought she'd say something like, "That sounds nice," or maybe even "Thanks for asking." What I didn't expect was her response, a sharp, almost rehearsed dismissal. "I don't owe you intimacy," Sophie said. At first, I thought I misheard her. I blinked, leaning forward like the extra inch would somehow change the meaning of her words. "What?" I asked, half laughing, half nervous. "What does that even mean?" She didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on mine, her arms crossed defensively. "It means exactly what it sounds like," she snapped. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." I felt the ground shift beneath me, the air sucked out of the room. 8 years. 8 years of late nights, sacrifices, and bending over backward to build a life together. And here she was, telling me, point blank, that what I thought mattered didn't. That my needs, my feelings, weren't worth her consideration. My first instinct was to argue, to fight back. I wanted to tell her how much those words stung, how they hit like daggers in places I didn't even know I was vulnerable. But the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, staring at her, my mind racing, my mouth unable to catch up. She looked back at me, stone-faced, as if daring me to say something that would make her care. It wasn't like this was new. It wasn't the first time Sophie had made me feel invisible, but it was the first time she said it so plainly, so unapologetically. That night, I barely slept. I lay there in the dark, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. Her words echoed like a broken record. "I don't owe you intimacy." Had I missed the signs? Had I done something to push her away? Or had I been fooling myself all along, thinking we were still a team? Each question came with a fresh wave of frustration. By morning, frustration had turned into something else. Resolve. She didn't owe me intimacy? Fine. But then maybe I didn't owe her the endless sacrifices I'd been making to keep our marriage afloat. Maybe I didn't owe her the version of myself that bent over backward, rearranged my life, and suppressed my own needs just to keep us from crumbling. I didn't say anything to Sophie right away. What was the point? Words hadn't gotten through to her before, so why would they now? Instead, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I started paying attention, not just to her but to us. I watched how we interacted, how she treated me, and how little effort she seemed to put into our life together. And the more I noticed, the more I became convinced that something had to change. I didn't know what that change would look like yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her words define my worth. Not anymore. Looking back, that night was a turning point. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors or broken dishes. But it was the moment I started seeing our marriage for what it was, not what I wanted it to be. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself what I could do to make things better and started asking what I deserved. Sophie probably thought the fight was over when she walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there with my thoughts. But for me, it was just beginning. The days that followed that conversation were different. Not because anything had changed between Sophie and me. If anything, the silence between us only grew. But because something had shifted inside me. For years, I had carried the weight of our marriage like some unspoken duty. I worked late, skipped outings with friends, canceled plans when she said she needed me, and bent myself into whatever shape I thought would make her happy. But now, for the first time, I started asking myself, why? I couldn't stop thinking about her words. "I don't owe you anything." It was such a cold, matter-of-fact statement. The more I replayed it, the more I realized how one-sided our relationship had become. I don't know if it happened gradually or if I just refused to see it, but the evidence was suddenly everywhere, glaringly obvious. I thought about the nights I stayed up late, working overtime to save for the down payment on our house. Back then, Sophie told me how proud she was, how lucky she felt to have someone who cared so much about their future together. I clung to those words, let them fuel me through exhaustion and stress because I thought I was building something for us. But now, those words felt like a distant echo, a memory from someone who didn't exist anymore. It wasn't just the big sacrifices either. It was the little things, the ones you don't even notice piling up until they bury you. The times I made her coffee in the mornings, not because I drank it, but because she liked to start her day with a cup. The nights I stayed up listening to her vent about work, even when I was bone tired, just so she wouldn't feel alone. The weekends spent running errands or fixing things around the house because she didn't like calling a repairman. It all seemed so small in the moment, but now, looking back, it felt like a pattern. I gave and gave and gave. And when I needed even the smallest thing in return, I got a shrug or an excuse, or worse, nothing at all. I started noticing how easily she dismissed me, like I was just background noise in her life. There was the time I came home excited about a new project at work, and she barely looked up from her phone. Or the night I made her favorite dinner after what I knew had been a stressful week, and all I got was a distracted thanks before she walked off. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger picture I had been too blind, or too stubborn, to see. At first, I told myself she was just stressed, that maybe I hadn't been doing enough to make her feel supported. But the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about stress. It wasn't about me not doing enough. It was about her not valuing what I did at all. I started keeping track, not on paper, but in my head. I paid attention to every moment she brushed me off or ignored me, every time I made an effort and she didn't even notice. The imbalance became impossible to ignore, a weight pressing down on me every time we were in the same room. And yet, the worst part wasn't even the imbalance itself. It was how easy it was for her not to notice. When I stopped trying, stopped asking how her day was, stopped filling the silence with conversation, she didn't seem to care. If anything, it felt like she preferred the distance, like my efforts had only been an inconvenience to her all along. One night, I came home late from work. The house was dark, and Sophie was in bed. I sat in the car for a long time before going inside, staring at the dashboard and wondering why I even bothered. It was my house too, but I felt like a stranger there, like I didn't belong. I thought about what she said, how she didn't owe me intimacy, and for the first time, I let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding. What does she owe me? Respect? Appreciation? Partnership? Or was that just something I'd imagined we had? I thought about the early days of our relationship, back when we couldn't keep our hands off each other, when we stayed up all night talking about everything and nothing. I missed that version of us. But the more I tried to picture it, the more it felt like a different lifetime. Like those people were strangers who had no connection to the life we were living now. That night, sitting alone in the dark, I realized something else. I wasn't angry because of what Sophie said. I was angry because, deep down, I knew she was right. She didn't owe me intimacy. But if that was true, then I didn't owe her the version of myself that had been bending over backward to keep us together. I didn't owe her the sacrifices, the compromises, the endless effort. And I sure as hell didn't owe her the benefit of the doubt anymore. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but in some strange way, it also felt like clarity. If Sophie didn't see our marriage as a partnership, then maybe I needed to stop pretending it was one. Maybe it was time to stop giving more than I got, to stop measuring my worth by her approval. Maybe it was time to start looking out for myself. After that night, something inside me clicked. It wasn't dramatic, like flipping a switch. It was quieter than that, more like a slow tide pulling back. I didn't wake up and decide to stop trying. I just stopped. Piece by piece, I began to pull myself out of our marriage. It wasn't out of spite, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a small, bitter satisfaction watching her notice the shift. No, it was more about survival, about protecting what little was left of me. The first thing I stopped doing was filling the silence. Sophie had always been content to let me carry our conversations. Whether it was over breakfast, during a drive, or in the evenings when we'd sit in the same room but feel a million miles apart, I was the one who kept things moving. If I didn't ask about her day, she wouldn't volunteer anything. If I didn't start talking about something, anything. The room would just sit in awkward quiet. So I stopped. I stopped asking, stopped prodding, stopped smoothing over the cracks with words. And to my surprise, the silence didn't bother her nearly as much as it used to bother me. At first, I think she liked it. I'd catch her scrolling through her phone, her face relaxed like the absence of conversation was a relief. But as the days passed and the silence stretched, something shifted. She started throwing out little comments, "You've been quiet lately?" or "Is everything okay?" But I'd shrug them off. I wasn't giving her an opening to turn it back on me, to make this about how I was overreacting or being dramatic. I wasn't playing that game anymore. The next thing I stopped doing was the little acts of service I used to think mattered. For years, I'd been the one who noticed when her coffee supply was low or when her car needed gas. I was the one who picked up her favorite snacks at the store without being asked or stayed up late helping her sort through a work problem she couldn't figure out. Those things used to make me feel good, like I was contributing to our life together. But now they felt like currency I'd been spending on someone who didn't even realize I was paying. So I let them go. If her gas tank was empty, she'd have to fill it. If she needed something from the store, she could go herself. It wasn't long before she noticed. "Why didn't you put gas in my car?" she asked one morning, her tone sharp with annoyance. I just looked at her and said, "It wasn't empty when I last drove it." That was it. No explanation, no apology. The look on her face told me she wasn't used to this version of me, the one who didn't jump to fix things before they became a problem. The strangest part was how easy it was to let go of these habits. I thought it would feel unnatural, like I was betraying some fundamental part of who I was. But it didn't. If anything, it felt freeing. For the first time in years, I wasn't bending myself into knots trying to anticipate her needs. I wasn't chasing her approval or fighting for her attention. I was just existing. And as lonely as that existence sometimes felt, it was still better than feeling like a ghost in my own life. Sophie's response to my withdrawal was subtle at first. She started poking at me more. Little criticisms about how I folded the laundry or how I left the mail on the counter instead of sorting through it. She accused me of being distracted during conversations we weren't actually having, of pulling away, like it was some grand betrayal. And maybe it was, in a way. But if it wasn't one I regretted. I think the moment she realized something was really different was the night I didn't react to one of her jabs. She'd made a snide comment about how I never listen anymore, her voice dripping with frustration. Normally, I would have apologized or tried to explain myself, desperate to smooth things over. But that night, I just looked at her, shrugged, and went back to scrolling through my phone. Her face fell, her eyes narrowing in confusion. For once, I didn't rise to her bait, and the look on her face told me it unnerved her more than any argument ever could. That was the thing about Sophie. She thrived on the balance of power. As long as I was the one chasing, the one fixing, the one apologizing, she was in control. But now she didn't know what to do. My silence, my indifference, threw her off in a way I hadn't expected. And the more she tried to poke and prod me back into my old role, the more I pulled away. I wasn't doing it to punish her, though I'd be lying if I said her frustration didn't give me a certain grim satisfaction. No, I was doing it because I needed to. I needed to see what would happen if I stopped trying so hard. I needed to see if she'd notice, or if she'd even care. And you know what? For a while, it felt like she didn't. But that was okay, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't putting her needs ahead of mine. For the first time, I was choosing me. It wasn't immediate. At first, Sophie didn't seem to notice the change. Or maybe she noticed but thought it was temporary, like a storm that would pass if she just waited it out. I wasn't sure which, but her reaction, or lack of one, was telling. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to be the glue that held us together, and she didn't seem to care. Not at first, anyway. But then something happened. The silence I left between us, the space I created by withdrawing, started to weigh on her. It was subtle at first, little comments, half-hearted attempts to restart conversations. She'd say, "You've been so quiet lately," or "Is everything okay?" in a tone that was more curious than concerned. I'd shrug or give her a neutral response, and she'd let it drop. She wasn't used to me letting things sit unresolved, and I think it threw her off balance. For years, I had been the one who worked to bridge the gaps between us. If there was tension, I'd smooth it over. If there was silence, I'd fill it. If she pulled away, I'd chase her, trying to bring us back together. But now, I wasn't doing any of that. I wasn't chasing, wasn't smoothing, wasn't bridging. I was just there. And my absence, my emotional absence, started to matter more than I expected. Sophie started poking at me in ways she hadn't before. Little criticisms about how I folded the laundry or how I left my shoes by the door. She complained that I didn't refill the gas tank, or that I wasn't paying attention during conversations we weren't even having. I could tell she was trying to provoke me, to get a reaction, but I didn't bite. I let her words roll off me, refusing to give her the satisfaction of pulling me back into the dynamic where she held all the cards. And that's when I realized something important. For years, I had been giving her control without even knowing it. Every time I apologized when I didn't need to, every time I chased her affection, every time I worked to fix things she didn't even notice were broken, I was handing her the upper hand. But now, by simply stepping back, by refusing to engage on her terms, I had taken that control away, and she didn't know what to do with it. The shift was palpable. It wasn't just in the way she spoke to me, it was in the way she looked at me. There was confusion in her eyes now, maybe even a little fear. She'd glance at me across the room, her brow furrowed like she was trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Not because I was trying to win some argument or prove a point, but because I had stopped apologizing for wanting more than she was willing to give. Her confusion turned into something else over time. Effort. At first, it was subtle. She'd bring me a cup of coffee while I was working late, or suggest we watch a movie together like we used to. But I didn't jump at the scraps of attention she offered. I let them hang in the air, unacknowledged. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to know if it was real. Was she trying because she cared? Or was this just another way to smooth things over without addressing the root of the problem? The more I pulled back, the more she tried. It was like watching someone learn to swim by being thrown into the deep end. She was flailing, grasping at anything that might pull her out of the mess we were in. But I wasn't going to be her lifeline. Not anymore. If she wanted to fix this, she'd have to do it on her own. One night, she finally confronted me. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual, like she was afraid of the answer. I looked at her for a long moment, weighing my words. "I'm just done trying harder than you," I said. It wasn't said with anger or malice. It was just the truth. Her reaction was like watching a house of cards collapse. Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. For once, Sophie didn't have a comeback or a defense. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. And for the first time, I saw something crack in her. Fear. Not fear of losing control, but fear of losing me. That was the moment I knew the dynamic between us had shifted for good. She had spent years taking my effort for granted, assuming I would always be there, always trying, always giving. But now, she was realizing that wasn't true. I wasn't going to keep pouring myself into a relationship that felt so one-sided. I wasn't going to keep fighting for something she didn't seem to care about. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. I could stay and let things continue as they were, or I could draw a line and see what happened. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to keep chasing her. If Sophie wanted to make this work, it was her turn to put in the effort. And if she didn't, well, I was finally ready to walk away. It was bound to happen sooner or later. The tension between Sophie and me had been growing like a storm cloud, dark and heavy, waiting to break. I didn't plan for it to happen that night, but then again, when do confrontations ever go as planned? I came home from work to find her pacing in the living room, her arms crossed and her face set in that tight, determined expression I'd come to know all too well. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the weight of her frustration. It was written in the way she didn't even wait for me to take off my shoes before launching into it. "What's going on with you, Ryan?" she demanded, her voice sharp and clipped. "You've been acting like a stranger in your own house." I paused, keys still in my hand, and looked at her. For a second, I thought about brushing her off, telling her I was just tired or distracted. But I couldn't do it. Not this time. What do you want, Sophie? I asked, my tone even but cold. I wasn't angry, at least, not anymore. I was tired. Tired of the same cycle, the same arguments, the same lack of resolution. She threw her hands in the air, exasperated. What do I want? Are you kidding me? I want to know what's going on with you. You've been quiet, distant, and… I cut her off before she could finish. I'm just following your lead. That stopped her. For a moment, she looked genuinely confused. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done trying harder than you, I said, my voice calm but firm. Her face flushed red, and I could see the flicker of anger in her eyes. Oh, so now this is my fault? She snapped. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay steady. It's not about fault, Sophie. It's about balance, or, more accurately, the lack of it. You made it clear what this marriage is and what it isn't the night you told me you didn't owe me intimacy. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, but she didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms tighter and said, and I don't. I'm allowed to set boundaries, Ryan. If you can't handle that, maybe that's your problem, not mine. The words stung, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I nodded slowly. You're right, I said. You don't owe me intimacy. But let me ask you this. What do you think I owe you? Do I owe you commitment? Do I owe you loyalty? Do I owe you anything beyond basic civility? Her eyes widened, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something crack in her expression. Fear. Real, genuine fear. I didn't stop. Because if we're playing by those rules, Sophie, then maybe I don't owe you date nights, emotional support, or even coming home at the end of the day. Maybe I don't owe you the sacrifices I've been making for years to keep us afloat when you've already made it clear that we're not a priority to you. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and something else, something I couldn't quite place. That's not fair, she finally said, her voice shaking. You're twisting this into something it's not. I never said I didn't care about you. Then show it, I shot back. Because right now, all I see is someone who wants the benefits of a marriage without putting in the work. You want me to be here, to support you, to listen to you, to care about your needs, but what about mine? Sophie, when was the last time you even asked how I'm doing? When was the last time you made me feel like I mattered? The room went silent. She looked like she wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead, she sank onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. I don't know how we got here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Neither did I. And that was the hardest part. This wasn't the life I had imagined when we set our vows. This wasn't the person I thought I was building a future with. But now, standing there, looking at her crumpled figure on the couch, I realized something else. I didn't feel the need to fix it anymore. Instead of sitting down next to her, like I would have in the past, I turned and walked away. Not out of cruelty or anger, but because I couldn't be the one to clean up the mess this time. If Sophie wanted to fix this, she'd have to take the first step. The morning after our confrontation, the air in the house felt heavier than ever. It wasn't the kind of tension you could ignore or sweep under the rug. It was a quiet, suffocating weight that followed me everywhere I went. I moved through my usual routine, making coffee, checking emails, and leaving for work. But something about it felt hollow, mechanical. Sophie was quieter than usual, and though I knew she was waiting for me to crack, to say something to ease the silence, I didn't. The text started around lunchtime. We need to talk, the first one read. I ignored it. Seriously, Ryan, we can't just act like this isn't happening. I left that one unread, too. I knew what she wanted. To drag me into another circular conversation where nothing got resolved. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction, not anymore. When I came home that evening, she was pacing the living room, her phone in one hand and a glass of wine in the other. I could see it on her face, the frustration, the confusion, the fear. She'd been rehearsing something, that much was clear, but I didn't let her start. What do you want, Sophie? I asked, dropping my keys on the counter. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. What do I want? Are you serious? You're the one acting like a stranger in our own house. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the sheer absurdity of it all. A stranger? That's rich, coming from you. I've felt like a guest in this marriage for years, Sophie. You didn't seem to mind then. Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she was going to shout, but she didn't. Instead, she bit her lip and sat down on the edge of the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I don't know what you want me to say, she muttered. I didn't either, but I knew what I needed to say. I can't do this anymore, I told her, my voice quieter than I expected. Her head shot up, her eyes wide. What do you mean, this? What are you saying? I mean, I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not, I said. I can't keep giving and giving while you act like it's enough just to be here. I've spent years pouring myself into this marriage, Sophie, and I'm exhausted. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. I'm not angry anymore, I said, surprising even myself. I'm not even hurt. I'm just done. I don't know if that means we separate, if it means counseling, or if it means something else entirely, but I know I can't keep living like this. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, she just stared at me, her lips trembling like she was trying to find something to say. But nothing came. So what? You're leaving, she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged, trying to keep my own emotions in check. Maybe, maybe not. But I think we need time apart to figure that out. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a split second, I almost caved. I almost walked over to her, wrapped her in my arms, and told her we'd figure it out like we always did. But then I remembered her words, how she told me she didn't owe me intimacy, and the fire that had been keeping me going reignited. This isn't just about you, I said, my voice firmer now. You made it clear what you don't owe me. Now I'm making it clear what I won't keep giving without something in return. I grabbed the bag I'd already packed and headed toward the door. She didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, as I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. I didn't look back. That night, I stayed at a cheap hotel, staring at the ceiling for hours and replaying the events of the past few weeks. Had I made the right decision? Was this the end of my marriage, or just the reset we needed to fix what had broken? By morning, I still didn't have answers. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to go back. The first few days apart were strange. I had dinner alone, sat in silence without the TV buzzing in the background, and went to bed without hearing Sophie's footsteps down the hall. At first, it felt liberating, a relief, even, but as the days turned into nights, the loneliness began to creep in. Not because I missed Sophie, but because I missed the idea of what we used to be. She called me on the third night. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hey, she said, her voice small and hesitant. Hey, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven, and I knew she'd been crying. I don't know what to do, she finally said. Her words hit me harder than I expected. This was the same woman who had always seemed so sure of herself, so unwilling to admit fault. Hearing her say she didn't have the answers threw me off balance. I don't either, I admitted. It wasn't much, but it was the truth. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page, even if that page was blank. The phone call that night was the first crack in Sophie's armor. Hearing her admit she didn't know what to do was something I never expected. For years, she had been the one with the answers, or at least acted like she had them. That vulnerability caught me off guard, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of the connection we used to have. But as much as I wanted to lean into it, I couldn't ignore the weight of everything that had led us here. After that call, Sophie began reaching out more frequently. She texted me every day, sometimes with long, rambling messages about how she was reflecting on what I'd said, other times with simple notes like, I miss you. I didn't know how to respond most of the time, so I kept my replies short and neutral. I wasn't ready to engage fully, not yet. A week after I left, Sophie asked if I would consider coming home so we could figure things out together. I told her no. If I was going to step back into that house, I needed more than words. I needed action. I needed proof that she was willing to meet me halfway, that she wasn't just saying what she thought I wanted to hear to bring me back under the same roof. To my surprise, she didn't argue. Instead, she started taking steps on her own. She signed up for individual counseling, something she had always dismissed as unnecessary. She sent me photos of the journal she was keeping, filled with pages of reflections on the way she treated me, the things she had said, and how she wanted to change. It wasn't just words anymore. She was trying, really trying. And as much as I wanted to be cautious, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. But here's the thing about hope. It's fragile. It's easy to let it blind you, to make you forget the reality of what brought you to this point in the first place. And no matter how much progress Sophie seemed to be making, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had taken me walking out for her to start trying. That thought haunted me. Was her effort genuine? Or was it just a reaction to the fear of losing me? Would she still be this reflective, this vulnerable, if I hadn't drawn a line in the sand? Or would things go back to the way they were once she felt secure again? I kept my distance, even as Sophie reached out more and more. She called me late at night, her voice soft and hesitant as she apologized for the things she'd said, for the way she'd made me feel. She didn't make excuses this time, didn't try to turn the blame back on me like she had so many times before. I was selfish, she admitted during one of those calls. I thought as long as I was present that was enough. But it wasn't. I see that now. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But belief isn't something you can force. It has to grow back on its own, slowly and carefully. In the meantime, I set boundaries. I told her I wasn't ready to come home. Not yet. I needed time to think, to process, to figure out what I really wanted. If we were going to try again, it had to be different. I wasn't going to keep chasing her affection or begging for scraps of attention. She needed to show me that she was willing to put in the work, not just now, but consistently. For a while, it seemed like she was. She kept going to counseling, even when I wasn't ready to join her. She sent me updates, not to pressure me, but to show me she was serious about changing. She stopped blaming me for how distant I'd become, instead focusing on her own role and what had gone wrong. And yet, as much as I appreciated her effort, something still felt off. Maybe it was the timing, the fact that it had taken so much for her to get here. Or maybe it was the realization that I didn't trust her not to slip back into old habits once the dust settled. Trust. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? It wasn't just about her actions now. It was about whether I believed those actions would last, whether I could trust her to value me, to respect me, to meet me halfway without me having to fight for it every step of the way. The nights alone in the hotel gave me plenty of time to think. I thought about the years I had poured into our marriage, the sacrifices I had made, the countless times I had put her needs above my own. I thought about the early days, when love had felt effortless, before resentment and exhaustion had seeped into every corner of our lives. And I thought about myself, about the person I had become in this marriage, tired, bitter, invisible, and the person I wanted to be moving forward. Could Sophie and I find our way back to each other? Maybe. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to realize that the answer didn't just depend on her effort. It depended on me, on whether I was willing to let go of the resentment, to rebuild the trust, to open myself up to the possibility of being hurt again. That was the hardest part. Letting go of the anger, the bitterness, the sense of injustice that had been my armor for so long. Because as much as I wanted to hold on to it, I knew I couldn't move forward, whether with Sophie or without her, until I found a way to let it go. And so, for the first time in weeks, I sat down with a pen and paper and started writing. Not to Sophie, but to myself. A letter about what I wanted, what I needed, and what I refused to compromise on. A letter about the kind of love I deserved, whether it came from her or from someone else. By the time I finished, I felt lighter. Not because I had all the answers, but because I finally understood the questions. The ones I'd been avoiding for years. In the end, it didn't happen the way I thought it would. There was no explosive argument, no dramatic confrontation, no grand moment of clarity where everything fell into place. The decision to walk away from my marriage came quietly, like a candle burning out in an empty room. Sophie and I kept talking over the weeks that followed. She was trying. I'll give her that. She kept going to counseling, kept sending me long, reflective messages about how she wanted to do better. But no matter how much effort she seemed to put in, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Why now? Why did it take me walking out the door for her to start trying? Why did it take this level of distance, this level of pain, for her to finally see what I had been saying for years? And even if her efforts were genuine, how could I trust they would last once the fear of losing me faded? Those questions haunted me. I wanted to believe we could fix this. I wanted to believe there was a version of us that could still work, that could still find the love and connection we once had. But every time I pictured going back, I felt the same weight in my chest. The weight of knowing I'd be stepping into the same cycle, just with a new coat of paint. I thought about the version of myself I'd become in this marriage. A man who was always giving, always compromising, always chasing after someone who seemed content to stay just out of reach. A man who had lost sight of his own needs, his own worth, in the name of keeping the peace. And then I thought about the version of myself I wanted to be, someone who didn't have to fight for affection or beg for scraps of attention, someone who was valued, respected, and loved for who he was, not just for what he could give. One evening, after another long day of silence and reflection, I made my decision. I wasn't going back, not because I hated Sophie, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I had finally realized that staying would mean losing myself all over again. I called her that night. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. "Sophie," I began, my voice steady but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us, about the last few years, about what I want for my future. And as much as I appreciate the effort you've been putting in, I don't think I can come back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost pleading. "So, that's it? You're just giving up?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "This isn't about giving up. It's about being honest with you, with myself. I've spent years trying to make this work, Sophie. Years of sacrificing, compromising, and bending over backward to keep us afloat. But I can't keep pouring into something that's left me so empty." She started to cry then, and for a moment, I felt the familiar urge to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But I stopped myself. This wasn't my mess to clean up anymore. "I'm filing for separation," I said gently but firmly. "It's not because I don't care about you. I do. But I can't keep holding on to a relationship that no longer serves either of us. We've grown too far apart, and I think it's time we both accept that." Sophie didn't argue. She didn't try to change my mind. She just cried softly on the other end of the line. And when the call ended, I sat there in silence, letting the weight of my decision settle over me. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, awkward phone calls, and quiet goodbyes. Sophie didn't contest the separation, and while it hurt to close that chapter of my life, I knew it was the right choice. Walking away wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was choosing myself. I wasn't staying out of obligation or fear or the desperate hope that things might get better. I was leaving because I deserved better. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with letting go. At first, it felt like stepping into a void, like I was free-falling with no idea where I would land. But as the days turned into weeks, that void began to feel less like emptiness and more like possibility. I started to rebuild my life, one small step at a time. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, spent time rediscovering hobbies I'd given up, and started focusing on my own happiness for a change. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when I missed the idea of what Sophie and I used to be. But those moments were fleeting, and each time they passed, I felt a little stronger, a little more certain that I had made the right choice. Looking back, I don't regret the years I spent with Sophie. Our marriage wasn't all bad, and there were moments of love and connection that I'll always cherish. But I've learned that love isn't enough, not if it's one-sided. Not if it comes at the expense of your own sense of self. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day, I'll meet someone who values me in the way I've learned to value myself. Or maybe I won't, and that's okay too. Because for the first time in a long time, I'm not measuring my worth by someone else's approval. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, I feel a strange sense of peace. I'm not angry anymore, not bitter or resentful. I'm just free. Free to be myself, to set boundaries, to demand the kind of love and respect I deserve. And that, I think, is the greatest gift I could have given myself.